Hey everyone, welcome back to Firsthand Globetrotting. I haven't done any traveling lately, so I'm back with another throwback vlog. This is part 3 of a trip I took to Ireland in 2014. I've already been to Dublin and explored the city, experienced the charm of Ireland firsthand, tried some of the most famous Irish drinks, went down to the southern part of the country, visited a castle filled with myths and tall tales, and so much more. In case you missed the first 2 parts, links are in the video description. And again, I apologize for the video quality since I took this footage back in 2014. But it's day 5 now, and I'm on my way to one of Ireland's national parks. I drove west to County Kerry so I could explore Killarney National Park. It's only about 3 kilometers from the town of Killarney to the first place I wanted to check out in the park, but I noticed they had horse-drawn carriages that I could take in. And how could I say no to that, right? Every time I drive through the Irish countryside, I can't help but admire how beautiful it is with just green, and more green everywhere I look. So it was almost like a fairy tale going through these amazing trails in a national park and admiring the scenery, with a horse up front doing all the work. But pretty soon the horse's job was done when I arrived at Ross Castle. It's the ancestral home of the O'Donohues from the 15th century, and as the story goes, the head of the family was sucked into the depths of the water. Every 7 years on the first morning of May, he and his horse rise up from the water and take a lap around the lake. I think I'm starting to see a trend with all of these Irish castles having wild legends attached to them. But other than being haunted by a ghost, having a lakefront castle must have been pretty nice. A huge part of the park is made up of lakes, so I figured a great way to see things would be out on the water. I hopped on a boat tour that goes around the biggest lake in the park, Lough Leane. As you can probably see, my luck with Irish weather was continuing with more rain and fog, but it was still an amazing ride. And the fog actually made for a really great visual, with the islands and shore just peeking out of the mist on the horizon. I'm a sucker for getting out on the water and seeing places from that angle, especially when you get to see some incredible natural beauty on the way. The lake has around 30 islands on it, so pretty much everywhere you look there's an island or 2 visible. And the entire lake is surrounded by beautiful green hills, almost like a green bowl holding in all the water. So far, both the horsepower and the boat power have been great choices. After I got back on dry land, I headed over to Muckross House. It's always amazing to see the types of houses and properties that the richest of the rich used to have a few hundred years ago. Not only is Lough Leane less than a kilometer away from the house, it also has its own slightly smaller lake right in the front yard. If you want to get a sense of how rich and powerful the owners were, they had the Queen of England come and stay at their house in the 1800s. The whole property was over 11,000 acres, but luckily for us, the last owners decided to donate it to Ireland and it became their first national park. This was the first time on this trip that I've gotten out of the cities and really gotten to spend some time enjoying the incredible natural beauty this country has. But after spending most of the day exploring Killarney National Park, I was really excited to see even more of the Irish outdoors and see their world-famous coastlines. On day 6, I decided to take a drive around the Ring of Kerry. It's a big circular tourist road over 150 kilometers long, and you're never very far from the coastline. And I didn't need to drive very long before I got some amazing views. I was planning to take a boat trip to Skellig Michael, a tiny, jagged island off the coast with a bunch of puffins living there. But the weather wasn't great and the waters were really choppy, so the tour ended up being cancelled. It was a huge letdown and threw off my plans for the day, but these things happen and safety is way more important. But luckily there was a really nice hiking trail a few kilometers away from the docks, the Bray Head Loop on Valentia Island. It wasn't a very long trail and a pretty easy walk, but what a view. The coastline was constantly visible and I could see the Skellig Islands off in the distance. Would have been nice to be on them, but this was the next best thing. Once I got out towards the end of the loop, it was like the earth just fell away and all that was left was a jagged, rocky coastline. You can probably tell by how the camera is shaking that it was incredibly windy up here. As I was walking, all I could hear was the wind whistling and the waves crashing down below. It made sense why the Skellig boat was cancelled, since if it was this windy here, it must have been even worse out by the island. and I love the tiny little trails that led down the rocky hill as close as possible to the water's edge. It may not look like it in some of these clips, but you don't need to worry, I'm actually a pretty safe distance from the cliffs. Not only would it be a massive drop down into the water, but the coastline is so jagged and rocky that you wouldn't stand a chance. Add in the big white waves smashing against the rocks, and you can see why I didn't try to get too close. It was so great up here. Even with everything I've read and all the recommendations I've gotten, the Kerry coast still blew away my expectations. I spent so much time just sitting down on the rocky, grassy hillside, listening to the sounds of the ocean smashing against the land, and staring out at the endless water in front of me. I guess if I hopped in a boat and sailed straight, the next place I'd hit would probably be the east coast of Canada. There was also a little house or signal tower sitting on the peak of the hill along the trail. I'm not exactly sure what it was or its history, but it had a nice rock wall surrounding it, so it must have been at least a little bit important. Inside is mostly ruins with some graffiti on the walls, so there's not much to see there. Except of course when you look out the window and realize what an amazing view this place must have had. At the tip of an island, on one of the highest points around, with a clear view out to the ocean. Doesn't get much better than that. After that amazing hike, I was getting a little hungry, so when I saw a sign for a chocolate factory, I couldn't say no, could I? It wasn't in a town though. Basically, it was just the chocolate factory surrounded by fields on every side with the ocean off in the distance. And there were even some cows hanging out right next to it. The sign welcomed me to chocolate paradise, so I knew I was in the right place. There were some signs and displays talking about how chocolate is made and where it comes from and all that good stuff, but I'll be honest, I was mostly there to see what it tasted like. And just my luck, they had a tasting area up front with plenty of delicious treats for sale. I wasn't really expecting to find a chocolate factory all the way out here, but I'm glad I did since I bought myself a bag full of goodies. Today ended up being a completely unplanned drive around the Ring of Kerry, stopping anywhere that looked interesting. The next thing that caught my eye was a little stone building on this long stretch of beach that seemed to be almost touching the water. This was one of the first sandy beaches I've seen today. The building is Ballinskelligs Castle, but I'd say calling it a castle might be a little bit generous. The description made it seem more like a little coastal tower house that was used to protect the area from any pirates that came around. But it's open to explore, so I went inside. It's from the 16th century, so now it's mostly in ruins, but the old stone walls still seem to be in pretty good shape. And the staircase was still holding up, so I climbed up to see things from above. About halfway up, there's a little window, I guess more of a hole than a window, giving a really nice view of the water framed by the stone wall. As I said, this wasn't a huge castle, so it only took a few more steps until I was all the way up at the top. There's a little entryway that must have been a door at one point, but it lets you look down at the rest of the ruins below you. Whoever lived in the castle must have had a pretty amazing view. You can see the nice sandy beaches off to the side, and then the shoreline curving and stretching off in the distance, and then some big, jagged, rocky areas right at the foot of the castle, and then even more coastline with some islands dotting the landscape. Such a cool visual having this little castle right on the beach. If you're a sucker for coastal views like I am, the Ring of Kerry is just so nice. I just love how steep some of the spots are, like a wall of stone holding back the ocean. Nearly every Irish person I talked to said that the western coastline was a must-see in Ireland, and after spending the day driving around Kerry, I definitely agree. On to day 7, and I was off for even more coastal drives in County Kerry. My plan for today was to drive around the Dingle Peninsula. It's not quite as long as the Ring of Kerry, but I was hoping it would have some equally amazing things to see. I started off in the town of Dingle. It's the biggest town on the peninsula, but it only has around 2,000 people living there, so you still get the small town charm of a seaside fishing village. One of the things I loved about Dingle is that it's one of the places in Ireland where they make a serious effort to teach and maintain the Irish language. So you can see signs in Irish all over the place. There's a famous solitary dolphin named Fungie that hangs out in the Dingle Harbour, but because of the rain, I only got to see his statue. I really loved the streets around town. Even though the weather was a little gloomy, the colorful buildings were so nice. It's right on the water with some nice local stores and restaurants, but what really hooked me was the local culture. I loved how so many people speak Irish here, and the fact that pretty much every bar has live local music. But by far my favorite business in the town was Foxy John's. It's a bar and a hardware store. Inside isn't big, but the counter on the left is a bar, and then the counter on the right is a hardware store. The server has to multitask, running between counters depending on what the customer wants. First time I've seen anything like this, but I thought it was such a cool business. I've already taken a tour of Ireland's most famous beer brewery and their most famous whiskey distillery on this trip, so it was time for something a little smaller. I made my way over to the Dingle Brewing Company. Like most breweries, they had some informational displays about how beer is made, a bunch of memorabilia from the Dingle Brewing Company, a peek and back at their production process, some of the secrets that made their beer so tasty, and all that sort of stuff. The beer they make is called Tom Crean's Irish Lager, so obviously I was pretty interested to find out who this Tom Crean guy was. Well, he was born on the Dingle Peninsula, but his life took him all over the world as a Navy officer in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He's most famous for going on a series of exploration missions to Antarctica, where by all accounts he saved some of his party members on more than one occasion. They even had a recreation of what I assume is one of the little huts or shelters that Crean would have lived in during one of his Antarctic adventures. I'm used to smaller craft breweries that make a handful of unique beers to try to set themselves apart from every other beer out there. But Dingle Brewing just has a single tried and true Irish lager. And of course, it's thirsty work learning about Tom Crean and his adventures, so I made sure to sample one or two at the end. As soon as I headed out of town and started driving around the Dingle Peninsula, there were more breathtaking views everywhere I went. You'd think that after spending 2 days driving around the coast, I'd be getting bored of all these ocean views. Nope, not even close. No matter where I am, I love a good view out over the water. But there's something about how rough and wild and untamed the Irish coastline is that I couldn't help but look at. As I was driving around, I kept seeing signs for prehistoric beehive huts along the road. I didn't really know what that meant or what they were, but it sounded interesting, so I stopped by. The path up was mostly some big rock walls, but it didn't take too long before I found them. You can probably see where they get their names from, since they look like a beehive that was cut in half. They have rings of loose stones stacked on top of each other, with each ring a little bit smaller than the one under it, making a dome shape. No one really knows exactly when they were built, but most archaeologists think it was somewhere between the 8th and 12th century. The sign on the road said 2000 BC, so I think the owners of these ones was using some of that colorful storytelling and marketing like I saw at Blarney Castle. Inside was small and nearly completely dark. The walls were actually pretty thick, so other than the door and a few openings near the roof, there really wasn't any room for light to come in. I guess these types of huts are peppered all over County Kerry, with a bunch of them here on the Dingle Peninsula. But, at least here, most of them seem to be under construction to restore them. It makes sense since there isn't anything holding the rocks together, they're just loosely stacked on top of each other. As I was driving around, my mind was blown by how drastically the coastline was changing in front of me. There would be long, sandy beaches with big waves slowly rolling in from the ocean. If it was a sunny summer day, it would have been the perfect spot to sit on a towel and have a beach day. But then a few miles down the road, it's like the earth just drops off into the ocean. All of the rocks down below are super sharp and jagged, so there's no way I'd go near that water. And then a little bit further, there's another awesome beach. Except this one was surrounded by huge rock walls on 3 sides, with the rocks only opening up to let the ocean in. It's almost like having your own private little beach down there. As you can probably tell, I'm completely in my element here. Even though the weather's been rainy and overcast, it didn't take away at all from my amazing time driving along the coast in County Kerry. As soon as I set my eyes on it, I was blown away, and I just had a smile on my face the entire time. Start to end, I loved my trip to Ireland. I got to have the big city experience in Dublin, see some famous tourist sites in Cork, and then the amazing small town coastal experience in Kerry. But if you told me I could go back to Ireland for a week, but I only got to pick one of those 3 spots to visit, which one would it be? For me, I think I'd definitely go with the West Coast experience in Kerry. The beautiful coastal views, the small town charm, the Irish culture, it was all just about perfect in County Kerry. I'd go back to Dublin or Cork in a heartbeat, but something about Kerry really made me fall in love with it on this trip. And sadly, that's the end of my trip to Ireland, back to the airport and back home. If you missed either of the first two parts, check the video description for links. And if you have any questions, ask me in the comments. While you're at it, like the video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to my channel. On Instagram, I'm Firsthand Globetrotting. On Twitter, I'm Firsthand Globe. Follow me on there. And don't forget, it's an incredible world out there, so pick up your passport and do some firsthand globetrotting of your own.